So today we are joined by Sarah Chandler, who has taught for My Jewish Learning many times. And she is a Brooklyn-based educator, and I'm thrilled to see what she has planned for us today to look at the Torah portion. So Sarah, whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good day, good afternoon. Hello to people watching this in the future. Great to be with all of you. And, it's funny with Parshat Shemini because we've had this as the Parsha for a while now. Yesterday we had the Shemini, meaning the 8th day of Passover, and not to be confused with Shemini Atzeret, the 8th day of Sukkot, which is, kind of like the mirror of this year. We're restarting the cycle of the holiday season. Not to be confused with the 8th day of the Omer, which I won't say when that is, but it's very soon to now. That is a thing that is soon now. There's a lot of things with 8. There's just a lot of 8s happening. In this case, we are looking at Parshat Shemini, the 8th day of really the dedication of the new priests, and those are Aaron's 4 sons. Again, something really interesting happening here. 4 sons, 4 plus 4 is 8. And in this case, the 8th day is mostly thought of as the first day of Nisan, which would have been a few weeks back. And we are going to look very, very closely at a very, very specific section of this week's Parsha. And I'm excited for folks who want to type in the chat their reflections, their thoughts as we go. And this is not a lecture. I really hope it can be a discussion. I always love it when people ask questions and share their thoughts. And if I don't get to every single comment or question, folks can even feel free to reply to each other's comments in the chat. And even if I don't get to them in the main screen, we could have a whole parallel class happening in the chat. And by the way, if reading the chat and watching the whole session is like overwhelming or confusing or too complicated, don't bother. Just be in the session, enjoy the class. Imagine we're all sitting around a table and there's some beautiful trees flowering outside, like where I live, and we'll jump in together. Okay. So in this week's Parsha, the first whole section is, again, this very, very elaborate description of Moses and Aaron getting together a bunch of animals for a sacrifice, and the idea being that they're going to anoint and pass on the priesthood to Aaron's 4 sons. And I've been thinking a lot about what the ancient temple must have looked like, what was like the layout of the Mishkan, because of the Parsha a few weeks ago where we learned about this Eish Tamid, which we also, most synagogues often now call a Ner Tamid, this idea for a ever-burning fire. And I have a lot of questions and thoughts about the ever-burning fire. So before we get to our source sheet, I want to open up the chat, and this is how I want to do it. So I'm going to just write a little line, because below the line now we're going to be having a little open discussion. I want you to, the best you can in words, describe and again, this is kind of like your instinct. Like, I'm just as curious if you've actually thought about this as if you haven't thought about this. If we were to go travel back in time and we were going to look at the Mishkan, and there's this Eish Tamid, there's this eternal flame, what does it look like? What do we know about it? Just literally anything. So I'm just we're gonna pause introducing ourselves. Describe the eternal flame in the Mishkan tabernacle. Imagine like you're a news reporter. You can't take any photos, but you have to describe it in words. Okay. So one person wrote it's small and blue. One person said that it's a fire that was never extinguished. It was lit from sundown to sunup. It's shimmering. Okay, someone says it looks like a torch. Someone says it's an enormous floating flame. All right, we have a lot of folks mentioning that it's like the Torah. It's like this symbol, perhaps. Okay, we had someone free floating, hot pink and glittery. Yeah, I'm really curious, by the way, how many folks are seeing like a table or some sort of metal object with that the fire is in it versus it's a floating. The size isn't huge, but it's bright. Thanks for saying bright. So part of the role of this flame is to have access to fire at all times, but part of the role is actually to light up. They're having almost 50 sacrifices a day. They need light, they need fire. It's practical. Blue fire with white light. So there's an altar. It's on a stand. Like there's some sort of stand that's holding the flame. We had, again, in the Parsha a few weeks ago, when I was talking about the eternal flame, it kept talking about the wood, having the priest putting the wood on the flame. It was one of the jobs of the priest. I imagine a giant candle slowly burning out. When it's fully burned out, another candle, you burn it again. Beautiful. So I just want to name, since we can't actually go on a little field trip to go travel through time, that we don't totally know. And when we think about archaeology and we think about, reading sections of the Torah where the Torah tries to describe what's happening, there are certain things that we can guess about, and then there are certain things that we just might never know about. There are some things where when we look at what other peoples did in ancient times, what they used for fire for different things, and how they burned the fire, we definitely know that it was wood that kept the fire going. And yet, immensely bright, and it needed to be kept lit. So what the most important thing I want us to keep in mind is that no matter what's happening in the temple, there's basically like this table, and there's a fire on it, and there's pieces of wood on it. And no matter what's happening, if a sacrifice is happening, if Moses or Aaron is talking, whatever is happening, there is always this flame. We might kind of think of it like a fire pit, but it's a table, and it's probably high up in some way. And then there are these embers. Okay, great. So I just want to name, it requires work to keep it going. And the eternal flame might be, and probably is different than the menorah, which is for light, and that has the oil. All right, so next question, and then we're going to go to our source sheet, promise. So my next question is, what was the fire needed for? So why is it, practically speaking, I love people are giving some really beautiful metaphors here, but practically speaking, why did we need, again, this is going to the Parsha a couple weeks ago, why did we need an Eish Tamid? Why did we need this eternal flame in the temple? So I love metaphorical answers are so welcome. It's a symbol of God's presence. The Torah literally tells us that so God's presence can be there. So illumination, spiritual inspiration. So what are some other practical reasons? So eventually to read the Torah, if we're talking about the temple, it brings warmth. Beautiful. It reminds us of, this is going to become important in a moment, the flame that guided us to Sinai. So it's connected to maybe the pillar of fire. So now that we used to be wandering where we are, and now we're in one place. Again, we're kind of jumping back and forth. I just want to name between this week's Parsha, where we are still wandering in the desert, and we have this Mishkan in the desert, versus the ancient temple in Jerusalem. And we're going to continue to kind of jump between those two. But yeah, so you need the fire for sacrifices. And, people didn't have like a little box of matches in those days. It actually was a thing that you needed to have a flame source, because just even lighting a flame was work. Okay, you can't just like grab a lighter or like, you know what I do sometimes, I just go over to the stove and touch my little candle or even like a piece of spaghetti. If I need to light something else somewhere, you know, I I don't always use a match but I probably have some matches somewhere in my house. So it was also just very, very practical because there were a lot of things in the temple that we needed fire for. We needed it for animal sacrifices, and we also needed it for incense. And sometimes we needed the fire itself, and sometimes we needed the coals. When I say the coals, I want to just make sure we're all on the same page. Does anyone want to say what I mean by the coals? Did I go to the grocery store and buy a paper bag of coals? Probably not. So what do I mean when I say the coals? So like if you can imagine yeah, the coals is really the embers. And everything is coming from wood here. So you have wood and it's like fresh, you know, logs of wood. And then when those cook down and then they're like embers, they're like kind of little black and orange little bits of wood. Those are the coals. So I want us to just make sure we can picture in our mind the difference between the big fire and then just the embers. And depending on what we're doing, we actually might need a flame. We need to transfer the flame, or we need the coals. And we're actually making the coals by burning the wood. Awesome. All right. It would be cool if I was like a cartoonist or something and I could draw all this with you, but I think people are getting it. We'll look at some pictures today. All right, so let's go into our story, and just so folks know, we are going to be looking very, very closely at the role of fire in this story. We will look a little bit at what happens in the story, but I just want to let folks know that we're not going to go too deep into the details of the story, except as it relates to what is happening with the fire, and trying to look at some archaeology and some text that will help us picture what is happening in the story. That's our main goal today, trying to picture what is happening in the story. And we have some great comments here reminding us that the trees that we're using for the sacrifice are from perhaps near Mount Sinai. And this idea that fire is amazing, but it can also be dangerous. And one thing that seems very clear and that keeps coming up is that the fire is related to God and God's presence. So we're going to see that in the Parshat. Okay. All right, so we're starting at the end of chapter 9. There's a lot of details at the beginning of chapter 9, if you want to read it later, that tells us about the original event of Moses and Aaron and what they were doing before we get to the pinnacle of our story. So essentially, there's a whole story of all of the animals and all the entrails and all of the burning. And Moses and Aaron, they chop up all these animal bits and they do all these sacrifices. Again, that's earlier in chapter 9. And this is how chapter 9 ends. All right. Moses and Aaron went inside the tent of meeting. When they came out, they blessed the people, and the presence of Hashem appeared to all the people. So if we look at what are the steps of the ritual, step 1 has a lot to do with slaughtering animals. And then the next step has to do with blessing the people. Vayvarchu et ha'am. So we don't totally know what that means, but most commentators say that this is actually the threefold priestly blessing, the may God bless and keep you blessing, that's always what that Vayvarchu et ha'am means. And then what happens after that? The presence of Hashem appeared to all the people. Vayera kavod Hashem el kol ha'am. So there's an order: blessing, Hashem appearing. And how do we know that? What is the form of this kavod that appears? And then let's look at verse 24. V'teitzei eish milifnei Hashem, v'tochal al hamizbeach et ha'olah, v'et ha'chalavim, vayar kol ha'am, vayaronu, vayiplu al pneihem. So fire came forth from before Hashem and consumed the burnt offering and the fat parts of the altar, and the people saw and shouted and fell on their faces. So notice, we just spent all of this time trying to imagine what's actually happening. Why do we have this Eish Tamid? We have this whole setup. And yet, for this particular sacrifice, how does it work? Well, there's this kavod, there's this presence of God. And the way it appears is it comes through fire. And this is not, we don't see Moses and Aaron going over to the embers or the coals and bringing fire to the sacrifice. It seems like there's this sort of zap that comes from this fiery cloud, and that's how this sacrifice is consumed. This is the Eitz Chaim commentary that I think is referring to the Rashi. Essentially, that the presence appeared to all the people. How did the kavod appear? Through fire. All right, here we go. So what is significant, and I'm inviting people to write in the chat, what else do people want to say or ask about this section? Moses and Aaron's way of consuming the sacrifice is there's this very specific kavod, and the kavod is the fire. Anyone want to add or ask anything? Okay, so this is going to be, we have a couple of comments. So I think the word before here has to do, with not before like before in time, but before meaning in front of them, meaning everyone experienced God's presence, because essentially, again, without reading all the gory details of chopping up the animals, we see this altar that has the sacrifice on it, has the slaughtered animal on it, and this almost like a lightning bolt, this fire just kind of comes out of the sky or comes out of this pillar of cloud, and that's how the sacrifice gets burnt up. And this is essentially a miracle that or a wonder that the people of Israel all see. And we're supposed to understand it. They saw it, shouted, and fell on their faces, meaning like they kind of freaked out. They were like, whoa, 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 whoa. They saw something that seemed impossible or magical. So yeah, people are adding some really great comments. They're experiencing God's presence after the blessing, and they're having this wonder and amazement. So we're starting with this because what happens afterwards is extremely different. So let's continue directly after Leviticus 9:24 and 9:23 and 9:24. For some reason, this passage got moved. I don't know why. So after 9:23 and 9:24, we go to Leviticus 10. So this is the main story that is really the core narrative of this week's Parsha, and it's about Aaron's sons, Nadav and Abihu. Now, Aaron's sons, so by the way, Aaron had 4 sons, Nadav, Abihu, Eleazar, and Itamar. We will see various important things that happen with Eleazar and Itamar later in the Parsha, but not in today's class. Now, Aaron's sons, Nadav and Abihu, each took his fire pan, and we're going to look at the Hebrew word, machtato. They each took their machta. What did they do with their fire pan? They put fire in it and laid incense on it. So even if we were to stop there, let's pretend we didn't care about anything else that happened. We just wanted to, again, we're investigators, we're reporters, we're reporting on this story, and we want to be able to describe in words what actually happened here. Well, first of all, they aren't using the main altar that their father was using. They are each using their own fire pan, their own machta, and we're going to look closer in a minute what that is. And they put fire in it. So from this line, we have to imagine that they are doing something totally different than what we saw in the other section. Totally different. They're putting fire in it, which is completely the opposite of the fire came forth. So they are both using their own fire pan and they are putting their own fire in it, which isn't to say there's never a time where a priest transfers the flame, but there's something about this day, this Shemini, where Moses and Aaron just demonstrated the other way to do it, and they're doing it their way. All right, so what happens? They put their fire in it, they laid incense on it, and they offered before Hashem. We have this very important word, Eish Zara, a alien fire, Asher lo tziva otam, which had not been commanded them. So they were not commanded to do it in this way. It's very unclear just from this one passage. Is it, is it forbidden for all time? Is it forbidden on this day? For whatever reason, the two of them jumping into this activity, it was not what they were supposed to do. Moses didn't command them, Aaron didn't command them, God didn't command them. So what happens next? And there's a lot of parallels in this passage from our 924. If we look back at 924, it opens V'tetzei eish milifnei Hashem. Fire came forth before Hashem. V'tochal al hamizbeach et ha'olah, and consume the burnt offering and the fat parts of the altar. So that's what happened to the sacrifice in literally a couple of verses before. In our verse here, now we're talking about Leviticus 10:2. V'tetzei eish milifnei Hashem, same exact words, and the fire came forth from Hashem. V'tochal otam, and consumed them. So didn't consume the sacrifice, consumed Nadav and Abihu. Vayamutu lifnei Hashem, and they died lifnei, in front of Hashem. And this is, of course, extremely difficult, extremely upsetting, extremely tragic. These two priests, again, maybe they're young, maybe it's their first day on the job. We don't know, maybe they're being arrogant. What are they doing? And to me, I'm very curious about the parallels between this verse that we just read, Leviticus 10:2, and the verse we read a few minutes ago. It almost seems like for some reason, I'm imagining like a ping pong ball where, it's you hit it and it goes one way, and then whatever angle it hits. And, there was supposed to be an order of operations where the sacrifice is happening on a table, the fire comes to the table, and the humans, are left out of it somehow. And there's something funny that happens. Again, this is where I kind of wish I was like more of a cartoonist. There's something happening here where, because they get involved with the fire, because they don't allow Hashem to send the fire from this kavod, they rush the ritual perhaps. And this is not only means that their sacrifice isn't accepted, it's as if they become the sacrifice. And we have this extremely, I think, disturbing and also vague line. Moses said to Aaron, "This is what Hashem meant by saying, through those near to me, I show myself holy and gain glory before all the people." And Aaron was silent. So there's something about the two of them being sacrificed where Moses is kind of reaffirming that there's something holy that happened. My interpretation personally is that Aaron is very disturbed because he has just witnessed not only his two of his four sons being murdered from this fire, but that their sacrifice wasn't accepted, and that perhaps it could be his fault for not teaching them correctly. This is the Rashi that I mentioned before, where it talks about the kavod. It's very strange, by the way. The Bible is very strange language for Moses to say, "This is what Hashem meant." That's like a not very common phrase in the Torah. So Rashi says, "What does he mean? This is what he meant," and it refers back to this kavod in Exodus. Read not here bichvodi, by my glory, but bimchubadai, through my honored ones. My brother Aaron, I know this house was to be sanctified by those who are beloved of the omnipresent God, and I thought it would be either through me or through thee. Now I see that thy sons who have died are greater than me, than thee. So there's something funny happening here where Moses is trying to make good of a difficult situation, or maybe imply that this is what was supposed to happen. I'm just going to take a peek at the chat. Yeah, there's really this question of murdered or sanctified. What's actually happening? Is this a tragedy? Is this an accident, or is this part of the ritual? Yeah, there's something about this Eish Zara. Maybe they're trying to play God. Their unholy enthusiasm, right? They're too enthusiastic. They kind of interrupted the ritual when it wasn't quite yet time. All right. So we have this question: what is alien fire? And this is I think a key question of our parsha, because again, if we're trying to imagine, if we're going to time travel, and we're going to look very, very closely at what's the makeup of the temple, of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, they have access to the eternal flame. They have access to the menorah. And then there's this also kavod, there's this cloud. They have this very efficient, I kind of wish I had this around, right? They had this cloud that was actually Hashem, that whenever they, did the sacrifice correctly, it would zap their sacrifice, and, they don't even need to light a match or pass any coals. It's very efficient. So I think part of it has to do with they lit it on their own. There's something about it's a third fire, and then that's what makes it the Eish Zara. I want to take a few minutes, and again, this is in order for us to, at the beginning when I ask people to describe what the fire is like, part of that is because, as someone who studied biblical archaeology, I'm always shocked by how many different ways we picture what was happening there, and how much we set up certain situations to try to associate our modern visions of what fire is and put it into this ancient picture. So what I want to do actually is I want to look at some pictures of what these fire pans might have looked like. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. So this is a very, very commonly shown picture of Nadav and Avihu. This is from the early 1900s, and this is, I believe, from a Christian source. And what I want you to see from this is, so behind them here, this is one depiction of what it might have looked like to have this altar that already has the fire going on it, and then each of them has these little incense holders. This might be the machta. We're going to see a few more pictures of what it could have looked like. And the idea here is they each had their own, and that's another thing that our commentators come back to over and over again. This was meant to be for a communal sacrifice or on behalf of the community, and then they each took their own machta. All right, what is a machta? So I find it fascinating because, again, when we think of the ancient temple, there's so many different things that used to be tools that over time became symbols. So this is from the BDB dictionary, machta. It's translated as fire holder, censer, snuff dish. And this could be, and what's interesting is that there are different materials it could be made of. It could be made of bronze, and it's something that both you use in order to transfer the coals, and it can also be something that you actually have the incense in. This is actually an example of what we think people used to use. And this is of a machta. This is from the Bronze Age. And when I'm describing it to my students, in the Hebrew school, I often bring out a dustpan, like a plastic one, just to be like, it looks a lot like this. There's a handle, there's a rectangular part. And one of the reasons why I want us to see this picture is because once we start seeing it in mosaics, it's not as recognizable. But from this picture, I think we can imagine someone holding the hand. We can be glad that it is metal and that it can scoop what we need to reach in terms of that. So here is another one. So this is from a mosaic from the 3rd century. And again, I find it really fascinating to look into archaeology, because the more ancient the artist is, the more likely we can figure out that, oh, this fire pan was drawn by someone who saw a fire pan that saw the original one, right, in the temple times. So if we hadn't seen this fire pan and then we just saw this mosaic, we might not be able to imagine what it does. But here is one, and apparently, if we were to see a photo of it, the middle is red, so it's trying to depict, hot coals inside. This next piece of archaeology, I'm going to zoom in just a minute. This next piece of archaeology is from the Beit Alpha synagogue mosaic. So we're talking about a synagogue that was built around Mishnaic or Talmudic times. And we have this beautiful, beautiful mosaic. But again, this is the floor. This isn't the wall. This is a tiled floor. And what did people do when they were, after the temple, after the second temple was destroyed? And they said, we want to look back on our Jewish history, and we want to think about what symbols are important to us, and then let's depict them with art. And so this one, this picture, probably the first thing you notice here of a familiar symbol is a menorah. Can people see my cursor when I go like this? When I move my cursor over it? Yeah, okay, great. So we see these two menorahs. We see probably this is some sort of ark. We see the Ner Tamid here, the eternal light. We see a shofar, and then we see a lulav. We see lions, and then what's very, very common is we see these three things together, actually. We see shofar, lulav, and again, if you hadn't seen the photo before, you might not have noticed it. But if you look even more closely right here, it looks kind of like there's just like a square with a stick on it. And then there's another one over here, shofar, lulav, machta. These three things appear over and over and over again at the beginning of basically on the years after the temple was destroyed and people are building these temples. And to me, the machta, we have the machta appearing many, many, many times throughout Tanakh, and we have it in this story. We have it in many other places, we have it in the Korach rebellion story. And to me, the idea of seeing the fire pan itself and the idea of each person using their own fire pan and that being a radical act, I want us to recognize this and then of course in post-temple times, it's just a symbol. It's just a symbol. It's not something that we use anymore. And so if we look at this picture, we're going to look at another one in a minute. I just want us to think about the relationship between, and thank you folks for saying your reflections in the chat. This image is from the synagogue mosaic floor of the Beit Alpha synagogue. So when you open your source sheet, there's a link to this article from Biblical Archaeology Review, and you can read more about it. You can just click on that link in your source sheet. But when I see this picture, what I find really interesting is that most of the things in this picture are things that are not just symbols from the ancient temple, but symbols that we still associate with. We still have menorahs, we still have the Ner Tamid, we still have the ark, we still have the lulav, we still have the shofar, and yet there's this extra symbol. And what's with that? What's with that incense pan? And we have different, unlike a shofar or a lulav, archaeologists haven't found an ancient shofar or an ancient lulav. By the way, same thing with menorah. We only have pictures of the menorah, but archaeologists have found drawings of the machta, and they've also found actual metal and also ceramic machta. We're going to see one more mosaic. This one's not as well preserved. This one I have actually seen myself let me see if I can open it. We can go even closer. This one I have actually seen myself in Sipori. So this is a synagogue floor mosaic that is in northern Israel. And we have on the right-hand side, and this is actually both on the right and the left, we have a menorah, we have a shofar, we have tongs, we have the lulav here, and then we have this kind of vision of the temple. And then this right here is our machta. Center stage. It's almost the same size as the base of the menorah. It's almost the same size as the entire temple. And to me, this makes me think of the ancients that designed the synagogue floor. This was an important symbol. The incense pan, the machta, the tool that helped us transfer the flame and gave us this idea of humans getting close to God through fire. So when you look at this picture, there's this description of it. There's a really excellent, PBS has close-ups of all the sections. There's some other sections that don't have to do with the machta. But to me, I'm really fascinated that the menorah over time has become such an important symbol in Judaism. And then the machta, everyone forgot about it. If I had started this class and just shown, let's say, this picture, right? How many of us would have been like, I know what that is? How many of us would have been like, oh yeah, that's a very holy object right there? Probably not that many of us. And yet, if we look at our ancient synagogue floor mosaics, when they said, what is a holy object, that the machta gets center stage there. Really, people are reflecting on this, but to bring us back to our original question, what is fire and what is the role of fire? And of course, there's so much more to say about the tragedy of what happens to Aaron's sons and the pain of that. And for us, for today, for the year 2023, as we move from Passover into counting the Omer, into our post-Passover time, I want to remind us of this holiness. And we might think, oh, well, in temple times, they had the Holy of Holies, and the temple times, they had the eternal flame, and I'm just a regular person in my house, and I just, have a regular day. And for me, the idea that we can look at both the fear and awe, in Hebrew that's the same word, yirah, of the fire, and I want to give everyone a blessing as we move into Shabbat, that when we light those Shabbat candles, when we turn on our ovens to cook a nice meal for ourselves, for our friends, for our family, that first of all, we are safe. We are safe with I'm not going to wear a fluffy shirt while I'm cooking over the stove. And I'm not going to light a candle in a center of my house where my cat might run by and catch fire, right? I'm going to be very, very careful with all my fire. And I'm going to allow that moment of fire to be something where I'm reminded that Hashem's presence is coming into my home and coming into my life. So I wish you all Shabbat Shalom, and I'll turn it back to if there's any announcements.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. I learned a lot today, and the chat was active, and people were also seeing lots of insights in this teaching. So thank you so much, and we will be here next week at 10:30. So we hope to see you all then, 10:30 a.m. Eastern time, wherever you are. We hope you'll join us. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.